Welcome everyone to Sea Trade Cruise live webinar, which we are entitling Been There, Done That, Live Entertainment in a Pandemic. My name is Ryan Stana and I am the CEO of RWS Entertainment Group, and I will be your host for today's session. And I want to thank all of you, truly all of you to join us throughout the world. We have a ton of people on today's webinar and it's really exciting to see all of you. Well, not see you, but know that you're here. I'm going to forewarn you, the start of this webinar is a lot of me talking, but I promise as soon as I go through today's game plan, this will be a fun time. So first of all, our house rules. Our guests today will spend about 20 to 30 minutes presenting their learnings to you, and then we will open it up to all of you on this webinar to ask questions. Feel free to ask these questions in the chat box to your right. When you think of a question during their presentation, please type that question in the chat box. If you're dying to know something very specific that our host and our guest did not bring up in today's webinar, please ask that question there because our guests have probably been through this already. I will try to get all questions answered, but if I don't, please do not get mad at me. Second, we will be recording today's webinar and it will be shared to you 24 hours after the webinar. So it will come to your inbox and you can watch it over and over again with your family, your friends. It's a good time with popcorn and a drink. So the purpose of today's webinar. This webinar will focus on what the cruise industry needs to know to bring entertainment back safely. This is an open conversation where viewers can learn and ask questions about how to make onboard entertainment safe and secure, but without losing the fun. So to do that and explain how they've been doing it, I'm going to welcome our guests for the day. First is Executive Producer of Operations and COVID-19 Compliance Officer at RWS Entertainment Group, Jake McCoy. Jake has devoted much time and resources since March to identify how to safely do show production on land and also at sea. And he just completed producing a segment for the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, and I'm sure he will have some interesting learnings from that as well. Second is Clayton Lawrence, who is the corporate manager of live show development for Cedar Fair Entertainment Company. Cedar Fair Entertainment Company is one of the largest entertainment and resort operators in the world, and they have legacy properties such as Cedar Point Amusement Park in Ohio, which if you love roller coasters, it's a great place to go, and Knott's Berry Farm in California. Cedar Fair and Clayton have been providing safe live shows at their properties since July, and he has many learnings to share with us as well. So welcome both of you, and Jake McCoy, why don't you take it away?
Awesome, thank you, Brian, and welcome everybody. So we're gonna go ahead here and start off with just a little overview of what we're going through today. We're going to break the webinar into 3 sections. The first section will be rather brief, just a general discussion about our approach and sort of how we've come to this information. And then we'll follow that up with a section on front of house operations and backstage operations. As Ryan had mentioned earlier, everything that we're presenting to you today has been tested in real life entertainment scenarios over the past couple months, and really even further back than that since the start of the pandemic. So for our approach, I'd like to start off with just a little disclaimer here. We are not epidemiologists. We have based all of our operational guidelines on reputable organizations, and everything that you're going to see in this presentation is based off of public health material from those reputable organizations. Some of these organizations you will have recognized, places like the CDC, OSHA, World Health Organization, WHO. And also on this list is CrowdRx. CrowdRx is a global medical response provider and has been providing medical guidance to RWS Entertainment Group throughout our entire protocol creation process. Specifically, we've been working with Medical Director Dr. Matt Friedman. He oversees Madison Square Garden, US Open, Yankee Stadium, a whole bunch of large crowd and entertainment spaces. These guidelines that we published, called the Health and Hygiene Protocol for Entertainment, were published on June 15th, covering everything from basic COVID knowledge from prevention and precautions, and then some more entertainment specific things like the rehearsal process, how to deal with studios, touching on sanitation procedures for your spaces. So this is a great document, and we'll circle back on this later with some access on how to get this. One thing I do want to mention here in regards to health and hygiene protocols, it was really important for us as a production company to show performers that we are doing everything we possibly can to keep them safe, especially in the early phases of the pandemic. There was a lot of sort of questions out in the air in the world of performers and in talent in general as to how this was going to work. And you have to keep them in mind as well. It can't all just be focused on the guests. So we're going to jump into front of house operations to start. So this is everything that is happening in front of the curtain. I'm going to start off with queue lines. So queue lines are not new to the cruising world and something we've been dealing with for a long time. If we just think about, even the disembarkation process that happens on every ship across the world every week, that is something that we've already mastered, right? But many of these concerns are going to need to be addressed even before the queue line. So there are things we're going to need to consider, like reducing capacity, extending hours, adding additional performances. If you had a show on board or in your venue that was typically performed twice a day, and you've reduced capacity on that venue, you might need to up the amount of performances to get the right amount of guests in there. So when we're talking specifically about the lineup of guests, our prediction here is that mobile and touchless integration is really going to be the way of the future. So there's been a little video clip going on from this company called Experience Ticket out of the Netherlands. They've already started to get ahead of this with an electronic phone-based system. There's also Mac out of Germany working on some ways to gamify social distancing, and using Bluetooth technology can actually notice that you are properly adhering to social distance protocols when you're on property, and they can reward you with things like line skips and also VIP access to shows or experiences. Also, because in theory we may be on a cruise ship here, so knowing that all of the guests are not far away and that they could just be as far as one floor up in their stateroom, the IPTV technology has gotten increasingly better on ships, which is the sort of overall network technology behind all of those televisions in your stateroom. So we're working on ways to be able to message to the stateroom to let folks know that if we were seating a venue by zone, we could actually send a message to your stateroom TV or your telephone or both, and notify you that we're ready to seat you at that time, and we can sort of avoid the whole queue process. Obviously, everybody knows at this point that we need to be spacing out 6 feet apart, which can be rather difficult in many entertainment venues. Oftentimes, we don't have that amount of square footage to be able to devote to just line spaces. 10 people in a line at 6 feet apart is 60 feet. So for a large venue space, that could be really difficult to accomplish. So guest seating. So simply just blocking off the seats is not going to be enough. That is an important part of it. But we're observing that ground plans and sort of what would normally just be documents and drawings that show what's happening on stage now need to exist further out. And really, we have to engineer the entire guest journey from the moment they get into a queue line until the moment they get to their seat. Of course, maintaining that 6 foot or 2 meter distancing all throughout. Floor decals and seat coverings are definitely important, but I sort of just advise to be cautious that you're not overdoing it with signage and decals everywhere, because if you go too far with this, the guests are actually going to tune it out, and it's going to be less effective. So really thinking through where that messaging needs to happen is a crucial part of this process. We've also been in talks with some folks in China who obviously were, because of the timeline of the overall pandemic, were quite a bit ahead of this country, and they've been dealing with this a lot more frequently. What we're hearing from them is that it's just cannot be resolved without a human component. So many of our venues in the leisure and hospitality industry sort of exist with this model that we don't need a whole lot of staff in the room, especially to seat people. That's going to need to be something we rethink, and we really need to approach this more like we would a Broadway house, thinking of box office staff, usher staff, and both to organize and make sure that people are maintaining their distance, but also to enforce sanitation standards as well. So we've suggested to many venues to start to put sanitation stations for hand sanitizer, and that would be something that your usher immediately when you walk in a room directs you, hey, can you please do a quick squirt of hand sanitizer for me, and now I'm going to direct you to your seat. So it is both an infrastructure situation that needs to be evaluated, and also a staffing situation as well. Lastly on this, something that is very specific to cruise lines, we've always thought about the main stage in these large venues as just being open seating. You could attend, there's shows published in your program, you can attend any show that you would like at any time. We may need to rethink that. We may need to think about starting to actually ticket these shows. Many cruise lines that we're working with right now have already started to develop online ticketing platforms so that you can effectively book a seat in the show just like you would for your dining reservation on board. Some people are going so far as to actually draw out the theater like a Ticketmaster webpage, and you can select your seat. And some folks are going a different direction and just allowing you to gain access to a performance to count your body in the room, basically. But thinking of these as just open shows probably isn't going to work anymore, just from a capacity standpoint. Venue sanitation, very important, especially with these large venues that have many different audiences throughout the course of a single day. And that's really key there. Both, cruise ships, resorts, parks, very, very, very rarely are we ever having a situation where there's only one guest who is sat down in that chair throughout the whole course of the day. We're probably dealing with multiple different shows, sometimes even using spaces for other reasons and entertainment. So it's important to consider the sanitation and disinfection process. These guests need to feel safe when they're entering our space, so they need to understand that they're in a hygienic environment and that we've done our job to keep them safe, especially because they're going to be sitting there for extended periods of time. So some things we can do about this: we can enhance filtration systems. Some people may have seen this is something that airlines have been doing for some time now, and it's kind of extended past airlines at this point. HEPA grade air filters, especially because theaters are normally very large spaces, you can do modifications like this without a whole lot of noise impact. And then commercial grade sanitation treatments can be very quickly applied to large spaces. You could use electrostatic spraying, which is very effective. Essentially, you can put like a hospital grade disinfectant in a backpack sprayer and treat an entire room very quickly, especially if you have more than one person spraying at the same time. There's also fogging techniques that are being tested right now. That is something you could do throughout the course of the day in between shows. We would also encourage deep clean sanitation procedures that can be scheduled during overnight shifts. But most importantly, with all of this on the sanitation, is that the guests have to understand that this is happening. So messaging is important. As we can see now, almost every company is putting out some sort of messaging saying what they're doing with COVID, so that we as guests understand that these measures are being taken. But sometimes just the messaging isn't even enough. So I would encourage, even if it's, I'm not encouraging to do, these large spraying, or fogging techniques with audiences in the room, but there are basic sanitation measures we can be doing to show the guests that it's happening. You could send in a hygiene crew right before the performance starts or as we're seating guests, so that they just have that visual connection and they're seeing people go through and doing a disinfection process, and they're understanding. That is probably more so from an optics standpoint, because you really want to make sure that you're spending proper time and using the right treatment technique. So it's not something we want to rush just so the guests can see, but it is something we want to reinforce at the final few minutes as well. Sanitation announcements can also be made as well. If there's specific house rules, playing those over a PA system can also be effective. Company housing. So company housing is not something that everybody has to deal with, but for those of us who are dealing with company housing, it is a big factor in the whole COVID situation. So the ultimate goal with company housing, regardless of a pandemic or not, is we want to provide a safe, clean space for our staff to reside in while they're working for us as entertainment producers. So it's important that they feel safe and that they understand certain measures have been taken. We're going to want to take a look at those occupancy requirements for company housing and really closely sort of analyze when it is appropriate or when it isn't appropriate to do room sharing. That's going to both depend on the types of individuals and the demographics of individuals we're sharing. There's of course your own local considerations to take in mind. Are you in a hot zone or not? Sort of what does your community transmission look like? But in general, evaluating that room sharing, maybe a room that was shared for 4 people is now taken down to 2. Really thinking through the end job of what these people are doing when they're rooming together. So if you have 2 individuals who are sharing a room and they're from different productions, then you're now at risk of, if something was to go wrong and one of those individuals was to get infected, chances are the roommate's going to get infected as well. And then you've got 2 people from 2 different casts who are now out due to a COVID-related illness, rather than looking at pairing up just people who are in the same show together. So thinking through what their function is, what their risk factors are, all of that are things we want to keep in mind when we're administrating company housing. Creating very strict and adhered to protocols for check-in, check-out, daily routines, turnovers. All of that is more important now than ever. And then also rethinking the company housing space as also now a new spot to get show ready. So if we're thinking about the world of a cruise ship, typically your cast is going to live below deck, probably somewhere near the theater. The idea of having them all come upstairs, in their street clothes and then going to a green room or a shared dressing room space probably isn't going to be able to be possible. The capacities in those rooms, for most green rooms and dressing rooms, they're not large spaces. So we have to think about, if we're reducing the capacity of that room, it's not going to work to just say, well, performer 1 gets ready and leaves, and performer 2 goes in and they leave, and 3 comes in. That's not going to work. You would have to call your performers hours in advance for the show. So we really need to get them into the backstage area show ready. So utilizing that company housing is the best alternative that we have right now. If they can get ready down in their cabin, they can come up with their costumes, with their hair and their makeup ready to go, then we really don't need much for them backstage beyond just a holding space, which is something Clayton can talk about in a little bit. And I'm actually going to turn it over to him right now to hop into Backstage Safety.
Awesome, thanks, Jake. So we at Cedar Fair have 13 properties, and this summer we were able to open 4 theme parks and 3 water parks. Cedar Point is our largest property. It's resort, and we were able to open 12 show products there. So a lot of what I'm about to review was workshopped and developed and executed for Cedar Point, because they had different versions of different shows, from dueling pianos all the way through large character shows. So we experienced a wide range of different scenarios. Prior to opening our properties, we had collaborated, we brought all the managers together in a series of hosted or curated chats. So we had technicians and dressers and character experts, and internally we formulated a lot of what we thought we'd experience while producing shows on paper. And then we had that as a guideline, which is very helpful, going back to what Jake stated earlier about how when we were picking up the phone and calling after everything had shut down and we were starting to restart our machine again and start productions, it was really important for us to have clear guidelines and put down on paper for the performer's sake of and technicians and everyone who we're now calling back to come to work. They wanted to know, how are we going to be protected? And that became a very important piece of the puzzle. That was the first stage, is to present our practices to the performers and show production. So we developed some rehearsal procedures. The first thing we did was looked at all the venues that we rehearse in, just as a food unit or just as a theater venue. We marked out and we applied the same graphic treatment, the same employee messaging that anyone would experience elsewhere on our properties. We applied that to the venue and the rehearsal venue. And we made sure that everything was safe, socially distanced, and it was clear from the second that the performer production walked in that they saw a change to how we were going to execute rehearsal. So it was very important to have that kind of upfront training and just conversation about, here's what we're going to be doing while you're in rehearsal. Then we, for performers specifically, they had to be on stage or together. We designed 4x4 squares that were taped out, and each square was 6 feet measured from each other, more if we could. And that allowed a director to be kind of in a crescent. So they would be at the front of the boxes, and then each performer had their own designated location. They had their own chair, their own music stand. We assigned their own rehearsal kit, which included a water bottle. We suspended use of water coolers or anything that could be a shared high-touch microwave situation. We assigned them their own box of pens, towel, anything that they would maybe utilize backstage, we brought to them and assigned in their 4x4 square. We also provided them with hand sanitization, their own hand sanitizer, their own cleaning materials. So they were in charge and responsible for their own little 4x4 square rehearsal space. In areas that we couldn't do it in a room, we divided the house. We blocked off 4 seats, measured that out if we needed to. So that allowed for our technicians, if they had to do a training, or ushers, everybody had their own pre-designed location. Also, that gave a routine. So when they came in, checked in for the top of rehearsal, they went straight to their square. So we also customized it a little bit and put their name, and it gave it kind of a friendly feel. And although they're restrained to their box, we try to make it comfortable for them. So that gave the routine that was built. And then everybody who works in one of the venues, performer, technician, usher, wardrobe, they all have their own checklist based off of their workstation that they were using or their surface they may be touching, so that at the end of rehearsal, they can log that they've gone through and they've completed the sanitization process, and then they signed it, and it became a good kind of ownership of these policies. It also helps us going back if we ever need to trace with contact tracing, who was in the venue, when and where. We could pull those sheets and it would give us an accurate log for the stage manager to say, oh, these were the people in the room at certain times. So that all became very helpful for us. The other thing we did was we looked at each type of performer. So actors, we tried to limit call times for everyone. So for actors, we tried to do web rehearsals as much as possible because that was easier to go through lines. Dancers, we taped off squares on the perimeter of the stage. So starting from stage left, we would mark off 6 feet and go work ourselves around. So that way, performers were on the perimeter of the main stage surface. So if the choreographer wasn't working with the performer, then they would resort to their location. It was also easier for choreographers and directors to know where people were at all times. So pre-designed, it may not be 4x4, it could be smaller, but assigning stage positions on the perimeter of the acting space or the dance space had allowed for dancers to know where to go and what to do when not actually working with the choreographer. Singers, we'll talk about face masks in a second, but for singers, same thing, try to rehearse as much vocally outside or in a well-ventilated area as much as possible. But when people are together, it was important for a face shield to be worn so we could see the mouths, and then we can also, for the musical directors, they can hear more accurately the pitch and the harmonies and all that sort of stuff. So still maintaining 6 foot where possible, but a face shield became our #1 tool in rehearsal because we were able to hear more accurately what was going on. Our next slide talks about performance. And these are items that we did in July, and we are looking at evolving as we learn more and guidelines become more COVID guidelines and CDC guidelines change, and we learn a little bit more. We are starting to develop processes for 2021 in which we will open indoor venues, but we made the decision to push everything outdoors and make sure that we had modified where possible. We knew that the guests at the time in July, they weren't necessarily comfortable being indoors. And in a lot of our markets, we just couldn't open indoor facilities. We weren't ready to. So we switched everything to an outdoor venue. We changed our shows. We modified, we limited the amount of performer guest relations. We cut anything that was a meet and greet after, or photos, or anything that would put the performer with the guests in close proximity. We reduced wherever possible. Blocking and choreography, we kept blocking and choreo together on stage, and we made a company decision that we could remove masks on stage so long as everybody was 6 feet away from each other. And so that really helped us create kind of normalcy with the shows. Anywhere that we couldn't get the guests to, or get performers away from each other, and it was just mandatory, we did put them in masks. And we'll talk about that in a second. We also, with props and costume pieces, we limited slash cut quick changes. We did 1 look shows for the time being until we could figure out the backstage flow and all that sort of stuff. And then also props. We have some reference photos on the next slide, but the props, we assigned a prop box, and we made sure that the performer was in charge of their props at all times, and we suspended use of switching or deck technicians assisting and that sort of stuff. So facial coverings, the performers all went through the same protocol when they were off stage as any one of our other employees in management. We were all very united in that whatever we were doing, whether traveling to the stage or walking to a break room, anything that is off the stage, the performers and technicians, production, they all experience the same as a guest or other employees. So face coverings, all performers wore those to the stage, and then they could remove them once they were safely in their positions, which we'll show you in a second on the next slide. We did go back and we looked at show run times, especially since we were outside. We didn't want large groups to congregate. We tried to socially distance the audience space as much as possible, wherever possible, but we reduced the number of performance time, one, to get the cast not next to each other on stage for a longer period of time, and then two, because we didn't want large groups to develop out in the house. And so that was for our standing room only shows. And then the audience perception. So we really wanted to make sure that when performers were on stage, the audience, and especially the photographs taken, displayed that our performers went through the same health and hygiene protocols and health screenings that all other employees and the guests went through. And so if we go to the next slide. Tapping into what I was just saying, on the photo to the right with the guitarist, he's wearing a white wristband, and it was important to leave the wristbands on the performers. Those wristbands daily, all employees and guests before entering the property would have to wear or have to go through a health screening. Their temperature was scanned, they had to answer certain questions in relation to exposure of COVID, and then we had to verify that everyone had a mask. And those colored wristbands changed daily. So the performers, and it signaled to the audience that these performers were also health screened and that they weren't treated any special than they were when they had to come through. So it gave a good kind of security blanket. Going back to, you could see the performers on the left, the two ladies there, they are walking to the stage location in their mask. So again, once they got to their location, they could remove it. But what we also did was put mic clips or clips on the mic stands. So that way the mask could hang on the mic stand. And again, going back to perception, photographs, if a photograph was taken with the singer, you would see that they do have the mask off, but it's on their mic stand. So it gave this added kind of perception. Backstage at our locations where possible, we installed you could see the picture in the middle. That's just a carabiner for masks. We wanted to make sure that performers would never mix up their mask and toss it on a table, and then all of a sudden nobody knows who's masked, and we were worried about the risk of sharing masks. So each performer had their own little location that they could clip to. To the right of that photo, you can see that there's a pink square. That pink square would have been assigned to a performer. So when they were backstage, they resorted to their pink square, and that's their prop box. So anything that they were grabbing or holding throughout the show would live in that box. And then after each show, they would sanitize it, and they'd be responsible for their own props sanitation process. Again, it helps with just knowing what to do backstage, and the social distancing backstage in some areas could be tricky as performers might need to cross each other. So the directors and choreographers knew where each performer lived backstage and could enter them accordingly. So that way they're not switching and moving all around backstage. So that became a very good tool for us. Down below, you can see a photo of a performer with a little guest. And that is how we did audience participation. So we assigned hula hoops, and they were all laid down. This was an atmospheric show that kind of popped up, and the performers would stand 6 feet. But because we couldn't always promise that, the performer would wear a face mask. And the hula hoops were all laid out in a way that they were 6 feet social distance. So whenever someone was called for a game, they would step inside the hoop, and then the performer would interact with them. We cut all sort of high touch objects out of these. We kept with the more Simon Says, red light, green light, freeze dance sort of game components when we did these activations. The next slide, we talk about musicians. So same policies and procedures, tried to keep them separated as much as possible, rehearse them individually as parts as much as possible before bringing everyone together to limit the time and the exposure and with each other. We decided, we did do a show with horns. We decided to keep them the furthest away from the audience, greater than 10 feet, and as far away as possible from performers. And so we kept them more upstage, and then we would find times where we would get rid of the cast and we would feature the horns. They would come in and do a kind of a solo or a little musical break, and then we would move them back up into the furthest point away from the audience. So the only place we've done horns is on large main stage shows that are giant, and again, we kept them the furthest amount away from each other. For the musicians and singers, when you start mixing, when you start spreading them out on stage, they have a hard time hearing each other. So we did have to go back with sound and reinforce either more wedges or monitors, or have to give everybody an in-ear monitor. So maybe a guitarist or bass that might not normally have that tool, we had to go back in and reinforce, just because again, we're now outside. The 6 feet rule started to become very tricky for us. Microphones, handhelds as much as possible. We would try to limit that and stick to headsets, sanitize the sanitization process. We built checklists and made sure that everyone wasn't sharing and all that sort of stuff. Great, so I think on the next slide. So for our costume meet and greets, we have the Peanuts characters, Charlie Brown and Snoopy. And so that was one of our first topics of conversation. We decided to really play up their characters, make them more animated, place them up on stages or behind barriers. And that was a great opportunity for us to kind of create more photo ops. And then we branded the backgrounds. So Charlie Brown might now be up on a stage with a backdrop that was now branded. So every photo we'd get the park name into. The other thing was we really looked at the high touch parts of the characters. We made sure that they don't hug or touch any guests. The character handlers, they have their own kind of satchel of disinfectant spray and hand sanitization, sanitizers. If the character did come in contact with the guest, then the character would just be brought backstage, a quick spray of disinfectant, air out, and then come back. We did a lot of hand waving, say hello to Charlie Brown or blow Lucy a kiss versus high fives. We suspended all high fives and anything that was guest touching. And then, like I mentioned, we were doing a lot of encouraging of selfies. Everybody, thanks to the Kardashians, knows how to take a selfie. So that's very, it kind of brought us into the current time. We made sure that escorts were not taking photos of guests and that it was all driven by the guests themselves. So we weren't touching their phones or anything like that. And then we made the decision to not have the characters directly talk about COVID or escorts. We didn't really acknowledge the COVID pandemic part of things, but what we did do is the escorts would say, Charlie Brown loves your mask, or, oh, that's a pretty mask. And so the parents really enjoyed that because they have a hard enough time with the kids reinforcing wearing a mask. So we got a lot of praise for acknowledging the kids in the mask and keeping it going. Now, one thing we get questions about is our characters themselves didn't wear masks, and that was a license holder decision. But that is something that we face a lot of questions. Why doesn't Snoopy, why doesn't Charlie Brown, the character themselves, have a face mask? We would love for them to do it, and if anyone had unlicensed characters that they feel they could do that. We heard a lot from guests, and we're actually experiencing this with our Santas, that the guests appreciate Santa in a mask and they feel like it is a collector item photo. So that is something that our characters don't wear masks, but everybody else around them does. And I'll
I can take this one, Clayton.
send it back over to Jake for the sanitization.
Awesome. So when we're talking about these costume characters in particular, they are obviously large pieces of fabric that would normally need to be cleaned on a regular day. And of course, now with COVID, there needs to be special precautions that are taken. So we've been working with International Mascot Corporation, who's a leading provider with a lot of costume characters around the world. They helped us come up with some of these guidelines that are outlined here in the bullet points. We're also talking to them as well as other mascot providers for actually looking at ways we can incorporate slots inside of the mask for disposable filtration cloths. So Clayton was just talking a little bit about masking characters on the outside for the sort of visual perception of the guests. What we're referencing here is actually on the inside of the costume, depending on what your costume character is and how the particular suit was created, they might have great protection, they might not have great protection. So we're looking at a way to be able to allow the individual who's wearing the costume character to actually be masked inside of the suit. One thing that is a major change here that I want to call out is this last bullet point, which is that the virus is currently known to last 1 to 3 days on most fabrics. So what we are advising for anybody who's using costume characters right now is you need to wait the full 3 days along with the sanitation that is listed above before you were to change out the character who is wearing that suit. So that can be you know, a new factor to consider when we're putting talent inside costume characters. But and it may actually require you to have more than one. If you were to traditionally have one suit and a different person wearing it over the course of the week, it would need to be really rethought now from a scheduling perspective. The illusion of touch. So what's interesting here is this is sort of a new term that has come up over the course of the pandemic, and this is actually the idea that performers can be at a safe distance while providing this sort of false sense of reality or false sense of depth. So the photo that we're looking at right now is actually two dancers that are on complete opposite sides of the room, way further than 6 feet apart, probably closer to 10 to 20 feet apart actually. But the photo that we're showing in the mirror here makes it appear as if they're almost touching. So this is sort of a theatrical trick, if you will. And it's actually something that a lot of clients are even asking for in their contracts. There's another side to that as well that Clayton can kind of mention.
Yeah, so we did a show at Cedar Point's pep rally. It's featured down below. When the guests would walk by, or even social media video of the show, because they are choreographed in a way that they are 6 feet away from each other, that photo right there, it kind of makes it look like they're not. And so we got a lot of concern / comments about how they weren't wearing masks, they weren't socially distanced. If they were there live, the stage manager, we did field some comments. The stage manager would walk them to the side and you could see how it was done. So for us, it did become a topic of concern. To mitigate that, we did do some videos featuring choreographers and directors that kind of explained our performer rehearsal process, and then we explained the illusion of touch and how we accomplished that. So we kind of try to educate people that we are still being safe about this. It's just the perception is just off. So the main concern there is photos and social media. They're not there. People aren't there to see it. So we did try to limit that as much as possible.
So lastly, to just kind of wrap things up here, feeling connected to each other is something that we would consider a basic human need. So as industry leaders in entertainment right now, we're viewing it as our job to rekindle this connection that has sort of grown apart over the course of the pandemic. So it's important that we're doing that, we're keeping our performers and our guests safe, and we're ultimately raising the experience for everybody involved.
Great. Thank you so much, Jake and Clayton, and thank all of our individuals on this webinar that have been sending in questions. So just to kick off some of the questions in our short time, Jake, what is the minimum distance from the stage to where the audience sits? What is the protocols you have put in place?
Yeah, so the actual minimum distance for regulation is there. It would be the same as we've been saying everywhere else. So the CDC is saying that 6 feet would be sufficient. We're going above and beyond that in the entertainment industry, recognizing that a full cast of performers on a stage projecting towards an audience, 6 feet may not be enough. So it's going to really depend on your theater. The nice thing about main stages is that whatever distance you have already built in from the edge of your stage to your front row is probably far sufficient. So I'd recommend at least 10 to 12 feet. There are medical reports that came out that showed there are some, tests that have shown virus droplets can travel as far as 14 feet. But at least 10 feet is going to give you more than enough coverage for what you need to do in that scenario.
Great. And Jake, you spoke about using the performers' cabins as their dressing room. The question's for Clayton. Clayton, how did you handle dressing rooms at your resorts and your parks?
So we utilized buildings that were not in use or theaters because we went outdoors. So we created new dressing areas. We did stagger actual dressing rooms where the performer would take their sanitized bag of costumes, go to a room, put their costume on, and then they would resort back to their green room designated marked off area, either in a theater house, or we did utilize indoor restaurants that were maybe not open. So we kind of had to spread everyone out. When it came to all of our shows were one costume look. So once they got into their costume, then we supplied robes so that they can go to a break area, or they can, in between shows, they could put the robe on over their costume to protect it. So they weren't getting in and out throughout the day. But finding areas that became their little world was easier for us because we utilized theater venues that were shut down.
Great. Thank you, Clayton. So Jake, how do you feel that this pandemic has impacted the entertainment industry in the long term? Like, yes, we're making all of these changes right now, but what is one thing that you believe will change from now and forever concerning entertainment?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the additional sort of bringing this idea of health and hygiene to entertainment, I think, is here to stay. All of these different restrictions and sort of preventative measures that we're doing could change, and much of what we've even been talking about today, if we felt like the world was safe, at a certain time, we could very easily start to redact these things and go back to what we would consider like a normal world of entertainment. So nothing that we're saying is drastically going to change things permanently. What I do think is here to stay is health and hygiene being a concept that is regularly evaluated in entertainment. So it was something that we've always said, yes, safety first. I think we've always thought about safety first as, that's for the light crew that's hanging a light, right? Or the scenic crew who's building scenery and making sure they're wearing hard hats, that type of thing. Safety now goes far beyond just normal industrial hygiene safety and is extending to this whole care of performers, care of our crew members. That is going to be here to stay.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. Clayton, at this time, are any of your performers in any of your productions actually touching one another, partner work, etc., or has all performer physical interaction been eliminated on your end?
I'm trying to think. I believe no, we are still operating under 6 feet from socially distanced from each other. We're not doing any partner work or any of that. I'm trying to think with our Christmas product. Um, Same thing. Now performers may hand something to each other, so that encroaches a little bit. But in a situation like that, they would be wearing a mask. So no, we're not quite there yet.
Yeah, and either are we, and we have found ourselves doing a lot of production work prior to going into rehearsals, really changing our shows without making any substantial financial changes. So that's about the same there. A question came in for you and I, Jake, on how we are meeting client expectations with the cruise lines we work with, and where are the key areas of coordination, and how have we been sustaining these relationships during the pandemic. I'll take that one if you don't mind, Jake. I think during
No,
this pandemic, what we learned most is there are a lot of times vendor and client relationships, and some of them are partnerships and some of them are client and vendor relationships, where this pandemic has taught us across all of our areas of business is we became true partners with our clients. And the conversations we're having today, we're having these ongoing conversations, and we're making sure it's a priority. Not only is it important to get our experiences up and running, but it's a priority to know on how COVID-19 is affecting all of our operations. So having equal conversations between our partners and us is really important, not only in production, but also focused on the health and hygiene. And I don't know if Jake, if you want to add anything more to that.
no, that was great. The only little thing that I'll add there is just that ultimately the different cruise lines who we work with are our clients, and ultimately the CDC return to sail order that's been put out is the client's responsibility. So all of those cruise lines, at the end of the day, if they want to sail, they need to tick all the right boxes, they need to get the paperwork done, and they need to get all of that accomplished. The thing is, they're not always, they're not necessarily going to know all of this information that we've just been talking through. So like Ryan said, they are relying on us very heavily as partners to help create this protocol. So I think it's less of a normal situation where somebody sort of gives us a scope and says, go do what's on this piece of paper. And now it's sort of morphing a little bit into, okay, here's our end goal. How are we going to get there together? How can we accomplish that safety across everything that we need to do, from administration to production to operation, maintenance, shipping, etc. So it's definitely a collaborative effort on all fronts.
Yeah, and I think across the line, it's collaboration, communication, and also, to be honest, passion. You have to love doing this, figure out the solution. And I think the collaboration, communication, and passion will lead to a great outcome. Clayton, this is a question for you. As far as across your properties and the additional steps you put in for COVID, how much of a percentage do you think it affected your entertainment budget for the year? Are we looking at, oh, it was a 15% increase, or you know what, it was 3% added in to make these changes? If you can give any sort of acknowledgement to that.
I don't have a figure, but I believe that in some ways we saved, because we went to one show look, one costume looks, so we didn't have 5 costumes to be built. We unfortunately had to eliminate some positions that just would have caused COVID challenges, such as deck hands. We didn't have scenery to build or move around, so I feel like we actually benefited a little bit on the savings of it all. We did spend money in graphics and stickering and, you know, new masks and that sort of stuff. But I do believe that it would be such a small amount. Because we are a large corporation, we were able to get a lot of the hand sanitizer and secure a lot of the disinfectants and stuff. So that wasn't necessarily an entertainment cost. So unfortunately, I don't have an answer percentage wise, but we did find efficiencies as we pivoted our strategy to mitigate for COVID-19.
Yeah, and I believe that's the same really for us here at our facility. You know, I sort of had sticker shock at the beginning of this to say, here's what we have to implement in our facilities. But now it is sort of evened out in the year and we've actually come in under budget. So there were efficiencies there. So I feel the same as you. Jake, this is a question that was brought to you specifically, must be a parade buff. They wanted to say, what was Jake's biggest learning while producing a segment on the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade? COVID learning, I guess.
So I actually think on that it would be come prepared and really staff accordingly. So for RWS, it's been very important that we have a COVID compliance officer involved in multiple situations and pretty much on site at any given time we're doing something. So that is very important. And in the particular situation of Macy's, everybody knows this parade starts pretty early in the morning. If you're watching it on television, you could turn on NBC. It started up at 9. So our call time was 5 a.m. Floats needed to be constructed at 4 so we could start rehearsal. It was absolute pouring, torrential downpour in New York that morning. We showed up with a full cast of dancers. I'm holding everybody across the street at Chase, and they were actually setting up their medical tent where everybody was going to be screened and brought through. I arrived at about 5:01 at that medical tent, and I said, I've got my team of dancers, I have production, wardrobe, everybody's right across the street. I'd like to get them over here now so we can bring everybody through clearance. And they had said, well, actually, we're waiting on our thermometer and our officer to show up. And I said, well, coincidentally, I happen to be a certified compliance officer and have my whole kit with me in my bag. And I'd be willing to help you guys.
You were prepared. That's the biggest thing.
I was prepared, and I started to screen through our staff right at the beginning there. And that's very important. That was extremely important to the celebrities as well.
So sorry to cut you off there, Jake. We're at the end of our webinar. Thank you, Clayton. Thank you, Jake. Thank you all for joining us on today's webinar. If you want that entertainment, health, and hygiene protocols, C-Trade's gonna put a email in the chat box. If you want to email for that handbook that we're utilizing, you can get that sent to you. We're excited to see this industry come back and be better than ever. So on behalf of C-Trade, have an awesome day. And I know this is probably a first for a webinar, but I'm in a Santa costume right now because I'm gonna go and be Santa for a kid's charity right now at noon. So I had to get ready and do a quick change. So on behalf of C-Trade, have a wonderful day. Happy holidays. Ho, 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 everyone. Thank you, Jake. Thank you, Clayton. Have a great day.
Bye.
All right, thanks.